Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Kat and Coca Report. We have two guests today. Our first guest is Dr. Coca, who I didn't think would show up. I thought this might be too hot for Coca of an episode. But here he is, and not only is he showing up, I think he is prepared. I think he's actually on top of his game here. And our other guest, our real guest, is an anonymous random person on Twitter by the handle of Medical Nemesis. Medical Nemesis, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For the audience who may not know the reference, what is Medical Nemesis a reference to?
Well, Medical Nemesis refers to the title of the book by an Austrian philosopher, Ivan Illich, and it basically means crossing of a certain threshold when medicine stops being helpful and it becomes harmful. Mm-hmm. And this is basically the second title of the book is Limits to Medicine, Medical Nemesis. And so I'm a big fan of Ivan Illich. I found him in some references in some other book I was reading.
We are fans too. I think you know that we had 2 episodes on Ivan Illich with our guest David Cayley. And
yes.
And this is great, and I'm very happy that you're here because you always have insightful comments on Twitter. You also have a Substack. Can you give us the URL for the Substack?
Gee, if I know it
or
myself.
The name of the Substack.
I think it's Medical Nemesis. Substack.
Oh, okay, that's right, Medical Nemesis.
Something like that.
We'll have that on the show notes. But today we're going to talk about vaccines. We're going to really, take a big risk here of being canceled out of all our outlets in discussing this book by Suzanne Humphreys that came on my radar. I want to give credit to a blogger who, again, blogs anonymously. I don't follow him particularly, but I was writing one of my recent blog posts on vaccines and free speech and so forth, and I came across a blog that he wrote, and his name, he goes by the Twitter or the pen name on Substack of Midwestern Doctor, and he had a blog post that was written maybe a year ago, where he talked about this book that I have in my hands by 2 authors, Suzanne Humphreys and Roman Bystrianik, and the title of the book is Dissolving Illusions, and the subtitle is Disease, Vaccines, and the Forgotten History. And it's about, at least according to the authors, demythologizing the vaccine track record, including vaccines against smallpox. And so it's a review of the epidemics of smallpox and polio in particular. And I was particularly interested in polio because whenever I, make a slight criticism against vaccines, Dr. Coca immediately reminds me that the polio vaccine was great, and without the polio vaccines, we'd all be in iron lungs. And I was a little bit suspicious of that story, although I was willing to accept it for the longest time. But now I've read this book, and I've read the chapter on the polio vaccine and the history of polio, not just the vaccine, but everything that surrounded the polio epidemic. And I must say that I'm quite impressed, and I've now I have ammunitions whenever I want to, be critical of vaccines. But I'm curious to have Dr. Coca's reaction. Anish, did you? Are you still thinking that the polio vaccine was sort of a great invention, and without which we'd all be on ventilators?
Well, I think I read Dr. Suzanne Humphreys. It's a very, very long book, and I didn't read all of it, but I did read the chapter on polio. Dr. Suzanne Humphreys was a nephrologist, interestingly, who left her field in part because of some anecdotal feelings she had, and anecdotal experiences she had about vaccines and what was happening in terms of nephrotoxic effects. So it is a very interesting story. But, we have to be very careful that that we clearly know that there are pro-vaccine ideologues and there are pro-vaccine zealots, correct? I mean, that's what the last 2 years have kind of made clear. But we don't necessarily, we don't necessarily want to join. Our job is to be as objective as possible. And it's pretty clear to me that Dr. Humphreys is a zealot in the other, on the other plank. So I'm not sure that we're necessarily, I mean, I don't think her account is complete, but it is clear after reading a lot more. I mean, what do we know about polio other than the fact that the polio vaccine, finished polio? And clearly that is not a completely accurate description of what was happening and how things were happening.
That's right. So you're right. It's a polemical book. It's not a book that tries to be balanced and show all aspects of the story.
And she makes but my problem with her is that she makes the same incredible speculative leaps that I think are worse than what the other side may be necessarily doing. Look, the problem for public health is what? The problem with public health is that they have to get buy-in on everyone taking the vaccine. And so clearly public health, whether it be for COVID or whether it be for polio, they seem to exaggerate both the risks of polio at any given time, but then they also seem to exaggerate the benefit of the vaccine, and they seem to minimize any potential adverse events related to the vaccine.
Right.
Now, it is possible for all those three things to be true, for all those three sins of public health to be true, and yet that is the right thing to do.
I mean, what that is the right thing to do?
Meaning, and yet it is the right thing to embark on some type of a buy-in strategy for the entire populace to end up in a better place. So
let's I think that's a good point, but let's come back to it maybe a little bit later when we flesh this out a little bit.
Yeah,
because in essence you're saying we could be overly exaggerating the risk of something, we could be overly minimizing the harms of the intervention and so forth, but yet it's still a good thing to have a mass vaccination campaign.
Because it's what you do. It's what you do with your patients in your room.
What do you mean I do? What is it? What is it? What I do?
Because I know after many years of interacting with you, I know that you are not a fan of the shared decision making. Well, it could be this. Well, it could be that. This is the data. This is the nuance. What do you want to do, patient X? You, Michelle, are very much of the style where you say, look, I think this is what you should do. The only way you can ever arrive at telling a patient,
right, correct. So,
is to somewhat not be completely honest with the patient about the fact that there is all this uncertainty and who knows what will happen with this, who knows what will happen with that. You, Michelle, are saying, I think you should get this defibrillator. That's how you're phrasing it.
That's fair. So I'm not disputing that approach.
No, what I'm saying is that
what I'm saying is that we'll see a little bit. We'll come back to see if having said what you have just said, whether it is still justifiable or justified to promote vaccines the way they've been promoted, right? I mean, that's essentially the bottom line. Medical nemesis, let's have you give us your insight. What was your from what is described in that chapter on polio, what is the thing that you thought was the most dramatic or the most
I had this book for many years, and I really haven't.
To be fair, so let's put a little context, because the book, I mean, one of the merit of the book is that it was written 10 or 12 years ago or 15 years ago, or maybe even more. I forgot. When was it published? 2012 or 2013? 2015, something like that. So way before the madness of COVID. So we cannot say that it's been written with, it's at least it's not tendentious. Its polemic is not driven by a reaction to COVID. It actually predates COVID, and I think that's in a way that's a good thing. But go ahead.
Whenever I read this book, I look at it. It claims to be a book of historical research, but one of the authors is a physician, so there is a medical spin to it. So when I evaluated, I look at it in which framework I was staying. I was trying to establish some kind of historical account of the events that happen and how we perceive them in the past, so we will be stuck in the past, or are we trying to reevaluate the events of the past with the knowledge that we have today? And when I'm reading, I would be probing the references in the book, and I would actually go and look at the references and see what they say, if they were retold correctly. And whenever I started reading the book, some of the references are suspicious to me. They are not good references. They're not references to necessarily good research. They, pad the book with the number of references, but do not necessarily give us good evidence of what happened. It twists what we call the truth. And just to reframe a little bit, when we look at all of these books and when we look at the greater good and public and, public health, or what a physician does in his room, how do we look at it? Do we look at it from the standpoint of one disease? Do we look at it from the standpoint of the greater good for society? And from which standpoint we look at it? Do we look at it from the standpoint of health, and who will define what this health is? So we would have to establish some kind of system of coordinates to decide what we want to do, why we want to do it, how we want to do it within this framework. So we would have to have a lot of assumptions, a lot of values, virtues, confining what we do. So this is pretty...
No, I mean, I think that's fair. But again, this is a book of polemic. So I think in general, the books of polemic, the contrarian books, I find them, I think, oftentimes quite helpful in the information that they provide to destroy the myth that the commonly accepted myth. And in this case, I want to focus on the polio chapter just because it's the book is very broad. It covers every single vaccine since the 1800s and so forth. I focused my attention just on polio because I knew the least about it, and it's also the example that is always brought out as being the thing that defends the vaccine narrative, the pro-vaccine narrative, the most. But polemical books are very good when they destroy the myth, but oftentimes they provide an alternative explanation for the historical events, and that's usually where they're weak. And I think in this case, it's true. In this case, on certain levels. But in terms of destroying the myth, I thought it was pretty good. I mean, I thought it was very good. I've looked at the references in the polio chapter, not all of them, but the ones that I came across that I thought were very interesting, and they're not referencing, or the authors are not referencing, a blog or another things like that. I mean, they're referencing what is actually published in the medical literature and the public health literature in terms of, a number of different things. One of them is what Anish mentioned at the beginning. So polio is a lot more rare than we think, that we imagine it, right? I mean, it's kind of an interesting epidemic. It's a modern disease. It's a disease that didn't exist before the late 1800s, or at least the mid 1800s. And I think everybody agrees, including the mainstream polio specialists of the 1950s, they all agreed that there was a new phenomenon that required an explanation, that it came on in spurts that were not completely well explained. And very interestingly, it's mentioned in the book, but there's research to show that in primitive populations, like in Amazon and whatnot, there's a huge immunity to polio is extremely widespread, without any evidence of the polio disease itself, the feared polio disease, meaning a paralysis. So there's a clear disconnection. A disconnect between the paralysis, right, the severe complication that one would have to address, and the wide prevalence of the poliovirus itself, which in many instances seems to be benign. So there's a cofactor. Bottom line is that there's a cofactor that is not well understood. It's not just the virus itself. There's an additional cofactor that
Well, from what we understand,
Yeah.
what we understand, but that's the thing. Like she, this is what I mean. She falls apart with this whole like she basically is this, touchy-feely thing that is saying that, oh, being in the countryside and being natural and allowing, no, I mean, probably the reason, if it is truly the case that the Aboriginal population that she has it does not have any flaccid paralysis that happens because of infective viruses, then it is simply because this is a population that has suffered through prior waves of this virus and is no longer novel to them. So there's some level of, whatever, whether through antibody cross-reactivity or who knows what. There's some reason why. But the problem for, Western America, so for the Western Hemisphere in the late 1800s, early 20th century remains, is that you clearly have a virus with a which does have very severe complications to the most precious of the population, meaning those less than 5 years of age, and it appears to be at least by 1916, or it culminated in the 1916 New York City epidemic. It appears to be getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So, I mean, that 1916 epidemic, I mean, it's an epidemic, Michelle, right? So in between epidemics, okay, it may be rare, but when there's an epidemic, right, between May and October, 8,500 children, mostly less than 5, are paralyzed in a tri-state area. 2,500 of those, approximately, die. I mean, if that happened today, that would create massive amounts of trauma. And it's not going to be assuaged by saying, well, there are 25 million kids, so 8,500 die, being paralyzed from the wherever down isn't going to matter. That is going to create trauma, and that's going to create a massive, panic and push to trying to come up with something. So this idea, so it's both right and wrong. Yes, it's the case that there is some incidence that's low, and especially in between epidemics, right? Before you get the 1916 epidemic or whatnot, that you're going to have some low incidence of cases. But you can't tell me that with those type of numbers that, this is something that isn't going to capture the minds of people to say, okay, we have to do something about this. We have to figure something out.
Right. No, it's interesting. You're absolutely right. The 1916 New York City epidemic is the one that put polio on the map, so to speak, in the imagination of the public. But I'm sure you're gonna next talk about this paper that starts to wonder about the origin of the 1916 New York City epidemic, written by H.V. Wyatt in 2011. And the title of the paper is The 1916 New York City Epidemic of Poliomyelitis. Where did the virus come from? And you read that, and you're nodding. So can you?
No, it's really, really fascinating. Again, that's why it's such an incredibly interesting story. And the parallels to today are so interesting, right? So this open vaccine journal that actually Suzanne Humphries, mentions in her thing, is that 3 miles away from the epicenter of the epidemic in New York City, which in New York City, interestingly enough, was in an Italian American enclave, an Italian immigrant enclave of New York City. That's where the vast majority of cases existed. So 24 cases in, I think, May or June. 13 of those were Italian children who were infected with paralytic polio. And so the idea was, and what people believed at the time, was that this was something that was brought in from Italy, immigrants, poorer, they were dirtier, all those tropes that existed at the time against immigrants that perhaps still exist today in some level. But so the Italians said, they were to blame for bringing this to the U.S. But it turns out, the surveys that were done later by the excellent investigators, this beautiful report of the polio epidemic by the 1918 U.S. Public Health Service, which nicely lays out and says that's completely false and completely fake. There's no evidence really that there was any travel back and forth among those kids. And by the way, there was no major epidemic happening in Italy at the time. So, it seems a little whifty to say this is why this is happening. But 3 miles away was the Rockefeller Institute. The Rockefeller Institute was ground zero of the world's research on the polio virus. And what were they researching there? They were researching this. They were using a monkey model, and they were literally passing the virus in between monkeys or whatnot in order to figure out how to make the virus more virulent. I think the idea is that the more virulent of a virus that you could have, the more intense antibody response that you could get, which would then allow for, some type of a treatment for polio. And, again, it's completely speculative. There's no way to prove it now. Certainly you can't go back to 1916 and do anything, but it's pretty interesting that the most virulent, the most transmissible polio virus happens in New York City, 3 miles away from the research institute that was researching how to make the polio virus more virulent.
Exactly. So we have a lab leak story that begins the most important polio epidemic of and a lab leak story that is brought into focus by the author of this paper that I just mentioned, H.V. White, who's a very, very well respected sort of scientist. I mean, who's got he's got like 300, 400 publications. I looked up his bibliography and his achievements. The guy is absolutely a genius in terms of epidemiology of not just the polio, but he's published on many different things and on science and on biology. I mean, one of these geniuses. He has papers published in Science, in Nature, in other.
And he's very careful.
He's very careful and measured in his.
He says.
But nevertheless, I mean, it's kind of interesting. We have right the thing that you said yourself.
How does it matter?
What's that?
I would like to get back to the book. The value of this book is this book makes you ask questions, and the questions I would like to say. The questions I would like to ask. So we have this, epidemic, in the poor part of, Italian immigrant population. The question I would have, who was the disease of concern to? Was it of concern to the Italian immigrants, or was it of concern to the public health officials? And where did this disease spread, and whom did it affect, and why it caused a reaction, and did it cause public outrage? And if we think of 1916, this is the time the World War I is raging in Europe, and there are American troops. Were the American troops in Europe during World War I?
No, they were, but it was a year later. It was 1917 that America entered World War I. They had not entered yet, but yeah.
So in 1916, the American public is concerned about involvement in the war, and people are getting slaughtered in Europe in huge numbers. So this local epidemic is not of public concern in the United States as a whole. And when the public health officials roll into the immigrant neighborhood to clean the streets and quarantine them and isolate them, the Italian immigrants resist. And there are threats against public health officials to stop reporting their infants to the Board of Public Health. They do not want the imposition. At the same time, they report that there are high rates of disease amongst the affluent, the clean neighborhoods, and there is contradicting data there. Some books are saying that there was no correlation between the level of cleanliness, and some are saying the disease was more prevalent in cleaner, more affluent neighborhoods. So you have this political angle of potentially dirty immigrants, bringing disease to the wealthy, affluent neighborhoods. And at the same time, there is contradicting data that this was not the case. So we have this politics of, dirt and immigration and, how public health plays into it and why a disease takes on prominence as a public health issue. So the politics of it.
But I think, I mean, wouldn't you agree that, if you have 8,500 children die of a infectious trend?
Wait, 8,500 children died?
Oh, sorry, 8,500 kids were paralyzed, and of those, 2,500 died. So almost one out of four died. And I mean, I think that is enough in May to October And New York City shut down. I mean, theaters shut down, pools shut down. I mean, people were terrified. I mean, they were stuffing doors with in the middle of the summer, they were stuffing doors and closing off all ventilation. So people were terrified. That doesn't mean, of course, the government acts in an overbearing fashion and starts quarantining, doing all the things that apparently China, the same things that China does now. They start doing. They start taking people away, and then there are threats to people. So all that being said, whether or not the government has an overbearing response that is violating of human rights. I mean, regardless of whether or not you're having a epidemic sweep through your neighborhood, you are not, which you may be scared about. You do not want a public authority coming in and taking your children away from you. So,
well, another point I wanted to bring up, we should not look at children as equally valuable as they are to us now when we have one or two children. And immigrant communities that have, a lot of children, and they lose a lot of them. So the loss of children historically wasn't looked at, especially young children. The attitude was God has given, God has taken. The loss of an older child was a tragedy. The loss of a grown child was a huge tragedy. The loss of a small child in many communities was not unexpected. So we shouldn't compare these numbers. And this is when the statistics comes in as far as the emotional appeal of the absolute numbers, say 2,500, it sounds like a large number of children, but in public health, we actually present data usually as a rate per, so many in a population. It does, it starts looking less scary. It might not be a public health concern. But if the number is adjusted between, an absolute number versus a rate.
But there's no question that the populace in New York and the surrounding areas were terrified. I mean, there's no question that they shut down movie theaters. There's no question that people said don't go to pools. It wasn't like something that was created by somebody. It wasn't Eric Fagelding wasn't tweeting about one child who died. It was. I think people were terrified, and I think it was an unusual spike in a way that was like and the plagues traditionally have, regardless of the brutish nature of history when it comes to death and plagues have always struck massive fear into people, right? And it may be that the COVID pandemic was the actual pandemic level of fear should be here. And thanks to Eric Fagelding and Eric Topol and everyone else, it was up here. But, back then, I mean, you can maybe make a case to say that the palpable fear people felt that was transmitted from person to person over, whose child dying or whose child was paralyzed, that probably was much more real then than it was here. And I mean, and if it was the case that it was like a small thing and, this is some part of a background rate of children that are dying that are less than 5 in 1918 because of unsanitary conditions and not being developed in some sense, then you would not have theaters shut down. You wouldn't have mothers who were stuffing the doors with cloth to try to prevent virus from getting in.
Wait a minute. Because I mean, you think is completely spontaneous? This reaction of fear is completely spontaneous? You don't think?
I think it's more real than what it would be today. If today somebody is trying to stuff the doors to prevent long COVID, that you can understand as a created fear that is boosted. But I think the fear in a poor Italian immigrant community, the fear in the tenements, Michelle, the fear in the tenements, to do that in the tenements, right? I mean, look at what. So I think that's a totally different level of fear. I don't think in the slums
was there fear? How did we establish it through some study?
Why else would mothers stuff in doors with no ventilation to have their children stripped naked? Because they were sweating so much and it was so hot, and they were stuffing the doors with cloth to prevent virus from getting in. They were clearly scared.
No, I understand, but don't you think that the public health authorities had something to do with the scare as well? I mean, I'm not trying to minimize the importance of this epidemic.
Yeah.
But first of all, we note that there's at least a reasonable possibility that it may have come from the medical establishment, the medical
No,
establishment.
but regardless of where it came from.
But regardless, I mean, I can't say for sure that, I mean, how can you say that it was not, that whatever fear there was not a fear that was, to some extent, sort of fanned by the flames, were not fanned by the reaction of the public health authorities.
Yeah, of course, there's going to be some of it, but I'm saying, okay, then quantify it. What it's like you're saying it's 1.25x then, and it's 8x now, meaning whatever it is, it's not. Look, my point is in the slums of Mumbai, okay, in the midst of the COVID pandemic, all right, there was not the kind of fear of COVID that there was in this case. The bigger fear in the slums of Mumbai were, how do we eat, because they're shutting down the economy. Right. I mean, when you read the accounts of what was happening in the tenements of these places where COVID where polio was kind of, where everyone heard of a case of a child who was paralyzed, which sometimes, some people will consider worse than death. It's not, I don't think it's nothing. You're right. I'm not saying that it's zero, that public health screaming on the megaphone, hey, this is what we're doing, blah, blah, blah. And at some point, maybe it's that peak, right? May to October.
Correct. It's May to October, and I mean, precisely. So there's something bad that happened under suspicious circumstances, and then the rest for several decades later, you have little outbreaks that are generally very self-contained, and the absolute numbers are extremely small.
Yep.
Of polio. I mean, it's in one city we'll have a few, a little outbreak, and it's self-contained, and nothing happens, and then it's usually in the summer. Usually in the summer, you see kind of seasonal thing, or you have, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. I mean, the numbers are very, very small. I mean, I'm not saying that but they're small. Number one. Number two, there's a diagnostic. I mean, everything that causes paralysis is called polio, or most everything that's paralysis is called polio. But I'm sure, Anish, you're gonna chime in that it's not right. That's
right. No, yeah. So that is part of the education is that it turns out that all that was, every childhood paralysis was considered, after the mid 18 something or the other, when polio was recognized as the causative virus or organism that was doing this. Basically, every paralytic kid with polio, for like 2 days would be considered, oh, that's a polio paralysis. And then some of these were self-limited and go away. And it turns out that, of course, not all of those were polio. And then once the vaccine came out, they became very stringent with polio paralysis.
With the diagnostic criteria for polio.
The diagnostic criteria, exactly. So you had to be paralyzed beyond 60 days. And so that in itself accounts for a significant drop in the incidence of polio-related paralysis. So, I mean, it makes the vaccine look better than it does.
Right. I had never thought of it, but how did they diagnose polio in those days, except if it was not on clinical grounds? So they knew that it was an infectious material, but what they called the virus, to prove that it was a virus, they would do something. I mean, essentially what was done, if they wanted to support the diagnosis a little bit more, they would take, fecal material or stool material, pulverize it, inject it in monkeys. And if the monkey, inject it directly in the brain of monkeys. And if the monkeys got paralyzed, then they would say, okay, this is, a virus. This is virus material. I mean, there was no electron microscope. There was no antibody test. There was no PCR. There was no isolated. In fact, even the viral theory was just very embryonic. So what they called a virus in those days was basically material that epidemiologically seemed to be infectious.
Right.
And that it would, they could pass it from monkey to monkey and cause, one monkey to infect another monkey by very, very crude methods. And it turns out that it's true that there are, other GI viruses that cause transient paralysis and whatnot. And there are things that may not be viral that cause paralysis. So another discovery in this book is that one of the, major public figure with polio is Frank Delano Roosevelt, FDR. There is, I think, reasonably pretty robust scholarship, again, pre-COVID, pre-everything else, published 10 years ago.
I know, but this is like saying that...
No. Don't. I mean, I think it's important. Let me finish.
Yeah.
Literature, there's a book written about it that seems to think that FDR did not have polio, but he actually had Guillain-Barré, whatever clinical syndrome he had. The people have, the historians have analyzed. Again, not anybody who has any axe to grind in terms of the vaccine controversy or being anti-vax.
Other than to sell a book, but yes.
What's that?
Other than it'll sell books.
Yeah, it'll sell a book. But what that, I mean, you can't discount it solely on that. But anyways, but the bottom line is that people today can look at the data and come up to different conclusions, and it's matter of controversy. So it tells you that the story is a lot more complicated than right.
Like
the story is not simple. The story is very complex.
I would like to mention Roosevelt, actually tying into the situation today. Roosevelt was very sheltered growing up, but after he started being exposed to the world around him, he became supposedly an encyclopedia of contagious disease. So there was an interesting personal story to his life that, possibly made him more susceptible to catching whatever he caught or becoming sick and paralyzed with whatever. So there are all of these personal stories of Flexner, who started working on the vaccine at the Rockefeller Institute. And actually, going back to the Rockefeller Institute research, which makes like polio vaccine, discovered great, we eradicated or, close to eliminated one disease. But at the same time, this type of research creates what is called the wet net, which brings us to Wuhan Institute with their leak. We're basically creating this infrastructure where we are breeding monkeys and we are contaminating them with something and we are crossing viruses and they possibly cross over to us and we're spreading them and taking them all over the world, so creating a possibility of new diseases. So while one vaccine might look like a great success, let's just assume that polio was a great success, but then the whole enterprise in its totality isn't, because it's very costly, it takes a lot of effort, it takes money away from other public health issues like, say, starving children, and it also creates a possibility of contagion arising in these labs that cannot control the contagion.
I think this is very well said. I think that's absolutely true.
But
again, I mean, the way these vaccines were developed, the way polio, the way, and again, remember Rockefeller Foundation, Flexner. I mean, all these people. It's at the maybe not the height, but certainly, the wave is rising of the doctors and the academic establishment, right? The academic community in medicine being placed on pedestals and given free rein to do everything that they wanted to do because they're, the saviors of humanity. And so these guys are, using very crude methods to, manipulate these viruses. I think it's plausible that one of them leaks. I mean, I can't imagine why that would not be a possibility, given what they were doing. When they do their diagnoses, it's a very crude way of diagnosing the stuff with their monkeys. I mean, it's actually pretty barbaric, and then they have an interest in. So there's a narrative that polio is a terrible public health thing because FDR has allegedly had polio, and we will never know for sure. But there's a narrative that is manipulated and kept. Because beyond the 1916 epidemic, at that point the numbers are very small up until the 1940s.
Yeah,
there's a narrative that not wanting to look at other causes or other factors and whatnot, and trying to make a story very simple, a narrative that keeps the population in a state of of apprehension and fear and whatnot. Yeah. So that finally the vaccine specialists come to save the day at the end when they create this the Sabin vaccine and the Salk vaccine.
Yeah.
And then they have the clinical trial, which we can talk about. They have the clinical trial. And as you mentioned, after the clinical trial, the reason they were able to develop the vaccines is because finally they were able to culture the virus, not just in monkeys, but they were able to culture it in cells, right? And create, the conditions to be able to develop the vaccine, which allows at the same time the diagnosis to be made much more stringently, so that by the time the vaccine is, proven to work, then
But-
the polio essentially disappears. For a
but
variety
Michel,
of
listen to what you're saying. All of these things.
Uh-huh.
This is the price of medical progress. So it doesn't matter
Yes,
that
Dr.
you have-
Offit. That's what.
that is the price. That is before I heard of Dr. Offit, I wrote those. That was the title of a blog, right?
Right.
I mean, if you look at anything that
But
we
that's
have
what I'm saying
done,
is the price is way too high. The price is way too high. I mean, what
no,
are the
I don't.
benefits?
But why? I mean, again, the type of things that were discovered, right, is how otherwise you have no medical progress at all. You're living like
That's not true. No, that's not true. You
No,
have
if
you have
you
That
don't-
is not true. If we go back to Rockefeller Institute, it's a very great, if we just backtrack to where we sidetracked into the wrong direction, in my opinion. So Rockefeller establishes the Institute. His grandson died of scarlet fever. By 1940s, 90% of children stopped dying from infectious diseases before the advent of, most of the vaccines and antibiotics. And there are all of these new Rockefeller men who are laying the foundation for the new profession of, physicians who are scientists. They're bedside scientists. It's a very different mindset. So we have the rise of laboratory medicine, which is also a very different mindset. And there are two very distinct types of physician scientists who think differently. And I would like to bring up the name of René Debois, who was a bacteriologist who discovered one of the first antibiotics in dirt. He basically found enzyme, and this is where the ecology of disease comes in. So instead of we're killing microbes, we're finding an equilibrium. And poliovirus apparently follows different track from rotavirus. They run the opposite, whatever. Mm-hmm. People become infected with them in different seasons. So one maybe is suppressing another one. We've seen this with this COVID and flu and RSV. We know that there is a very complex interaction going on, yet we take a very conscious, judgmental decision to go on the path of war instead of trying to find an equilibrium and peace of what we can live with.
No, because for some people there is no peace. For some people will die of the flu, some people will die of RSV, some people will die of the polio virus in the wild. So the natural state of humans is to try to prevent that from happening. The natural state of humans is not to say that, this is happening at such a low rate that we don't care about this. This is equilibrium. It may be equilibrium for all of us who have survived all of this, but no, there's going to be some children in an ICU in Philadelphia, that some child is going to die of some infectious virus. And I understand why you and Michel
but you discount all the people who are dying because of that mentality, because of being of the warpath. They're dying as the COVID experience is the precise.
I think fewer children die now. Look, for all Suzanne Humphrey says about the polio virus and the fact that the non-polio paralysis continues, there is no more polio paralysis. Where is the polio paralysis now?
But in the US? How much would it be if there was so?
Okay, meaning we did eradicate it, right?
My point is that it's conceivable based on what we know and there are other things that we haven't talked about here, but it's conceivable that without a polio vaccine, the polio numbers would be very small. It's conceivable for a number of reasons.
Entirely speculative.
No, it's not highly speculative. The numbers were very small before. We know that a large number of different viruses cause the same paralysis. We know today there are lots of kids who have transverse myelitis, right? And they still have it. Michel. We know that they survive because treatments are better. We know that early treatment, in fact, that was a very good thing in the book. Early treatment was completely disregarded by the medical authorities. And here we're talking about this Sister Kenny, the inventor of physical therapy. Let me finish. Who a lot of these kids, when they had polio, the treatments were barbaric. They would be just the same it was for the treatment of acute MI. The mortality of acute MI was huge because doctors would force patients to stay in bed and they would die of pulmonary embolism. Back in those days, when kids had polio, they would put their limbs in casts and whatnot and immobilize them and do something that are terrific. Whereas when Sister Kenny, this physical therapist, came on the scene from Australia, she realized that the outcome from polio could be greatly improved with physical therapy applied early on. So,
Baloney.
There could be a lot of mitigation from the impact. But what you don't see is that when you say the only outcome you're interested in is the number of polios now after the vaccine are zero, and you completely overlook all the damage that this mentality, which is what medical nemesis was talking about, has created on the other hand.
I understand.
So there's a huge mentality that has been extreme damaging in many different ways that we can't quantify, and we can't.
Let me say, Sister Kenny, you're basing it on this account, all right? And then she has a picture of a child jumping on a bed. That child clearly does not have severe the children who had severe flaccid paralysis, they have a withered away limb. That child does not have that. So no, I don't think Sister Kenny, unless Sister Kenny is the second coming of some god.
No. But wait a minute. You don't think that it's conceivable that doctors back in the 1920s and 30s would advise people with paralysis the wrong way, in a way that would be harmful and would cause people with mild paralysis to have a more severe paralysis than they would otherwise have? You don't think that's conceivable?
It is perhaps possible they would have.
That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
No. But that denies. No, that completely. No, I can't let that go, because it completely washes over the fact that even you and I have seen certain cases of limbs that are withered. That is not because some doctor X number of years ago said, no, you shouldn't do something. You think, Michelle, if I told my 6-year-old child, no, just rest, don't do anything with that limb, and because of that child will have a withered limb 10 years. No way. You can't tell a 6-year-old not to do something with his limb. He will do something regardless. So that whole part of Suzanne Humphries, she is basically latching on just like
no, she's latching on multiple strands, and that's one of the strands. It's one of the strands, and I think it's absolutely
very weak.
That's right.
Very weak.
No, it's not weak at all. I think it's not weak at all. I think
because here we kind of deviate, but and this is Michelle's favorite subject. Here we're deviating into population medicine, where we treat everybody in napalm and everybody with a drug, which again is a judgment. And these drugs, these polio vaccines, they do cause illness and paralysis in some people. And these vaccines are not perfect. They have side effects, and they do not prevent, but can actually cause polio and paralysis.
That is exactly correct, and that is why the Sabine vaccine, which was the oral polio vaccine, which after whatever was happening, and who knows, Michelle, this is the thing with Suzanne Humphries and folks like this. It's that there are some strands that are clearly true, but then they have these thin strands, and you build it to be this large castle in the air that doesn't make sense. So, for instance, we know that the Sabine polio vaccine, the oral polio vaccine, right, that partly was rolled out because of the Salk vaccine Qatar disaster. Because of that, the Sabine vaccine, and it was a live vaccine that was fed to people, right, fed to children, and of course, in some people, it turns out you learned that it actually may get more virulent as it passed through the stool, and therefore people that it not only could infect people around you, but it could it could actually cause polio in those folks, because there were 30 to 40 cases a year caused by the vaccine. They now switched back to the Salk killed vaccine, which after they fixed the issues with production.
The issue that killed a large number of people also.
Yeah.
But you're not.
Michelle, according to Paul Offit, it killed more people than the epidemic would have killed. Right?
But
again, you say the price to pay. You say it's the price to pay for medical progress. I mean, I can't believe that.
No, it is.
More ridiculous statement.
We don't have any more. We don't have any more polio flaccid. We don't have any more polio caused.
What a punic victory! What a punic victory!
It is not a punic victory at all.
We've been victorious against polio, and then with the trail.
We don't have any more. We don't have any more polio caused, and we would never have learned. That's the problem. We would never have learned, Michelle. We would not have coronary bypass surgery today if not for a lot of mistakes.
Have you heard about the ischemia trial? That you can have ischemia should be treated medically, and the benefits of medical therapy are much better than.
Yeah. So are you not gonna? So should we not have ever gone down the path of revascularizing a left main lesion? Are you going to sit on a left main lesion? My point is no. And then,
but again,
transplant, congenital heart disease. I mean, all of these things have a price to it. People die. So how can you be so simplistic and naive to say that you are not going to ever have. Of course, when you try to do something new in medicine,
I'm not saying that it doesn't have a price. I'm saying that the price is not justified. That's exactly my point.
Justified. There was no more polio.
How is
that a victory when polio would have gone other way?
Because there's no more polio-caused paralysis.
But we are overlooking that the countries where they're trying to, eradicate polio still with this Bill Gates Foundation and whatnot, local people there, local public health say that we have more pressing concerns. You dump in all the money onto this, support of the public health tool of eradication. It's an idea, it's ideology. It's actually harming other programs. We have limited resources. How come we're not focusing resources on research of how to treat people who have polio and rehabilitate them instead of dumping money on the whole population of the world just to support an idea that vaccination is a great idea?
Well, again, you can let India decide, no? I mean, are there not Indian doctors that are able to decide this, or let them decide. This is the data. They have it available. Let India decide.
I'm against shared decision making. It's not shared decision making. We have to.
It's not a data issue. This is the problem with this whole data issue. They are judgments. So you have all of this information, and we have more information than data. How come we're not following ecological approach? We still have a lot of questions that have never been answered about polio. That research has stopped because we decided to pursue a relatively easy fix. And ever since the 1930s, 40s, and 50s,
the same thing could be said about right.
It's a complex phenomenon. We're not factoring in complexity. We're making these magic bullets, and they work in one parameter, but then we have a severely diseased population across the board in all the diseases. So we win in individual categories, but we lose as a whole.
Anish, if there wasn't,
again,
Anish, your argument is exactly the argument of the COVIDians today.
Yes,
because they would say if there was no counter narrative today against the COVIDians, they would be saying the lockdowns were great. Look, there's very few hospitalization for COVID now because we've conquered it thanks to the lockdown, thanks to the vaccine mandates. It's the price to pay. It's the price to pay. Kids are out of school for 6 months. It's the price to pay. We've COVID now, today in 2022. Nobody's scared of COVID anymore.
It's intellectual.
And that is the price to pay.
It's intellectual laziness, right? Intellectual laziness. It would be, it's one thing. Again, you cannot compare COVID and polio because COVID.
Yes, I'll give you the parallel because I wrote them down. I'll give you the
virus. The virus does not. The virus is relatively speaking has a tiny mortality and morbidity.
So does polio. Come on. So does polio. Polio. 90% of the people.
Nope. In a May to October time span, 2,500 children did not die.
But that's
COVID,
an anomaly. That's an anomaly. That's an anomaly that was caused by a lab.
It happened, and it could happen again, and they didn't know whether it could happen again.
You're worse than Eric Lingding and Peter Hotez. You're like, it's like you're like worried about the mutation and the mutant.
No, you can't. If you compare COVID and polio, it's to not understand either.
Well, and I'll
tell you what the parallels are. The parallels are clear.
Here we come to something that's called also a very salient theme in all of this, disease perception, because there are people who would rather have HIV rather than COVID, because long COVID is much worse than HIV, and they are epidemiologists and they are MDs who are saying this. So this perception of what polio was, or what COVID is tainted even in professionals.
Exactly right.
It's losing the plot if we compare polio to COVID. You don't want.
That's not the point. That's not the point. What you're using.
That is the point.
No,
the point is perception.
You're both married to a certain ideology, and you are sticking to it.
But you, Mr. Middle of the Road guy,
no,
completely. I'll tell you what the parallels are.
One stance on COVID, another stance on polio.
This is what the parallels are.
Yeah.
You had a manipulation of the narrative during polio, clear.
That always happens.
Clear. You had a manipulation of the narrative that was clear that made things look a lot worse than they were. You had an incestuous relationship, between philanthropy, Rockefeller Foundation and the like, and public and regulatory bodies, and the big media back in those days. You had it back then. You had extremely ambitious and mendacious scientists. Sabin was a guy not a guy to be trusted. I wouldn't want my daughter to date a guy like Sabin. Sabin lied, he backstabbed, and they were all like this. They all lied and backstabbed their way to power. You had the covering up of errors. They made huge errors along the way. The Cutter incident and the other pharmaceutical labs that were equally,
Wyatt, yeah,
they were equally
Wyatt
dangerous. Cover up on a large scale. There was ignoring of helpful early treatment, right? They had the same as in COVID. COVID, you have the proponents of early therapy. You had early therapy back then, the Sister Kenny that you poo-pooed, but promoting instead, vaccines that were very poorly vetted. The Cutter incident is a big example.
They were
very poorly vetted. I mean, for example, the Salk vaccine, they thought that it was an inactivated vaccine, and it turned out that if you take the virus and put formaldehyde in it, you still have perhaps 10 to 20% chance of having live virus at the end of the day. So you had, and that caused, according to Paul Offit, Mr. Vaccine USA caused more death than the epidemic would have caused itself. And you have loose definition and diagnostic criteria, the same way we have seen with COVID, right? Loose definition of what is a COVID death, what is a COVID, loose definition and loose criteria. I think the parallels are exactly the same. I mean, that's the whole point. The point is not to compare the virulence of the polio virus to the virulence of COVID. No. That's not the point.
The point is
the people back in those days, you would have swallowed it.
No. I went into this with a very open mind. I didn't know much about Suzanne Humphries, but again, read her chapter. She's again, you're talking about faith and stuff, right? Suzanne Humphries is clearly a massive lightweight, right? Vitamin C, IV vitamins. That's
that's what I said at the beginning. That's what I said. No, that's what I said.
So I went into this with an open mind to say, okay, look, what is maybe, and I talked to all my parents who were alive in the 50s to say, and there are certain things that are correct. There are certain things that are correct. Clearly, there was an exaggeration of and it may have been an exaggeration built on real fear. Who knows? There was an exaggeration of certain things in terms of polio and how severe the epidemics were. But you can't get away from the fact that in 1916 there was a massive bad epidemic that didn't have Twitter, that didn't have all these things, that was terrifying to people for a good reason, right? And you can't escape from the fact that there was a clear amount of science that demonstrates that vaccines, antibodies, etc., do work to help prevent COVID. So this idea that look, the vaccine works. Does the vaccine work or not? Of course it works to prevent COVID, right? Was there a problem that they could not foresee in terms of why it is a certain company manufacturing things a certain way would result in this? So as unfortunately, Michelle, you are never going to have, otherwise you will never have any drugs. You are never going to have a drug that comes out that is going to be perfect, right? But I don't know that I don't. You were never.
That's not the point. That's not.
It is the point, Michelle.
You're being defensive because you think that being critical of the polio story is going to be the end of Western civilization.
No. I don't think that at all. I think it is a big mistake to throw out throw out the way that science advances, right? Because you're painting with too broad a brush. So look. There are lessons to learn from polio that we should understand. So the lesson so we didn't even talk about what exactly the Cutter disaster was for people that are listening.
Go ahead, because
the Cutter disaster,
but I think it's really worth.
It's an incredible story, right? There was after the Salk vaccine trials of 1.2 million people or 1.2 million kids, they basically was shown to be effective. And again, people were crying about the fact that we now had a therapy for polio. And again, this is in a world before social media and before Twitter. So this idea that polio was kind of it's like the Democrats saying that the GOP has created crime. Like polio was a real concern.
No. Had a lot of interest in that I completely disagree. How can you don't think the population could be manipulated in the 1930s?
I think they can be manipulated a lot less than they can be manipulated now.
Are you kidding?
I don't
How
think
can
long
you?
COVID.
I mean,
I don't think long COVID.
you had Nazi Germany and things like that, and you think that crowds cannot be manipulated, could not be manipulated back in those days the way they could. You had 3 television stations, and they were all in bed, and you had. Are you kidding? On the contrary, the possibility of manipulating public opinion was much greater back then than it is now.
There was manipulation, and I would like to bring up the case of Herbert Radner, who was the director of public health in Oak Park in Illinois, and he refused to roll out polio vaccines because he didn't think they were properly tested. And he was correct, because later the cutter accident happened. He was actually on the verge of being fired when there were all of these deaths, and he was spared, and he held the round table at the time in 1960 on the present status of polio vaccines. And it's a wonderful paper of people discussing it in real time. They were very mainstream, public health and statisticians and drug developers who all weigh in. And you can see that the vaccines are imperfect. They do not deliver what they promise. They are extremely imprecise. There is no consistency in their production. They are contaminated, just like COVID vaccines were contaminated, because who knows how they purify them. And anyway,
I'm sorry to break this to the public, but look, everything that we do in medicine has a learning curve attached to it. That learning curve in medicine is going to be attached to morbidity and mortality. And yes, in medicine, there are going to be dead ends. Michelle, we have written about this.
It's time we identify the dead ends. That's exactly what we want to say. We want to identify
so the dead end, right? So, but the dead
ends that have many deads in their,
but then you will dead end every single novel therapy. You will be arguing against surgery to correct, the blue babies would still be born today and would be dying because, God forbid, we try to figure out. And there's going to be deaths along the way of children.
Look, if saving blue babies mean. If saving one blue baby mean you're going to, kill 500 grandmothers, that's not necessarily, the calculus that I'm prepared to accept as being. That's what you're saying. You're saying.
I never knew you to be a utilitarian. Are you a utilitarian now?
No, that's what you are.
We should do what's correct, right? We should try to.
That's exactly right.
Save blue babies.
But here comes the important part. So we have a baby who's born with congenital heart disease.
Yes.
This baby needs assistance. We decide that we are able to help that child. That's one thing. Then we have a completely normal, healthy child born. We give it a vaccine and we cripple it. This is a completely different issue. Does a physician have a moral or legal right to treat somebody who is healthy to prevent a statistical outcome in a population? I argue that no, you don't. Because medicine is supposed to be applied to people who are unwell, cannot cope on their own, and are specifically asking for help.
But the problem with that is that parents and children were begging for the polio vaccine, right?
That's
parents and children were begging for the COVID vaccine.
I mean, it's like saying, look at the people who are begging for mask mandates to be reinstated. You have thousands of people who are begging for mask mandates to be reinstated and for kids to be masked. You can't. I mean, it's such.
So we should have people. So what should we do? We should not allow the development of the vaccine at all. No, you're asking for a novel therapy to be developed with zero downside. No, that is the wrong message to come out of the mRNA vaccine. The mRNA vaccine story. It is not bad that the mRNA vaccines were created. The bad thing was that they tried to cover up any potential adverse events because they were so desperate to put on this front of the vaccines being 100% safe and effective. Instead, if they had gone with the strategy of saying, let's try to vaccinate the highest risk people, and as the signal comes out in young men, let's try to stop that. That's the right way to do it. The right way is not to say we will not develop the mRNA vaccine, because so formaldehyde, the Qatar incident, which we never finished, was that after the Salk vaccine trial came out and it showed that the vaccine was effective. Okay, the vaccine was effective. The number of people that were vaccinated that got polio was vanishingly small. Okay,
I wouldn't say vanishingly small. I would say it was, but I would
hold on. Let me finish. Let me finish. That's ridiculous.
I mean, there were clearly people with polio in the treatment arm.
No, that's belied. Yeah, so there were a lot fewer in the treatment arm than there were in the other one.
I wouldn't say vanishingly small.
Much lower.
And it's funny because it was not a randomized
No,
trial.
no, no. Let me finish.
It was not a randomized
So
trial.
it doesn't matter. So after that, then there were a number of manufacturers that were assigned to make the vaccine. They were all given the recipe and the protocol. One of the places was one of the pharmaceutical companies was called Cutter, and it turns out that the Cutter lot of vaccines caused a large number of again, when I say large, why do we call these large? But again, if you look at the absolute incidence, that's low. But the numbers were significant. The numbers were significant and unfortunate that a bunch of children were paralyzed by getting the Cutter vaccine. So then they went back and sorted out that exactly why that was happening, and it had something to do with some processes that they didn't know at the time. So again, it was that whole process, ultimately got us a safer Salk vaccine. And by the way, because that happened, that is partly because that happened. The Salk vaccine had this bad flavor to it because of the Cutter incident, right? They then switched to the Sabine vaccine, which is the oral live vaccine, right?
Which nowadays is the number one cause of polio in the world.
And because of that, and because of switching to that, okay. And then of course there was a pause. You know that the Surgeon General paused the vaccine, right? And again, the numbers are there. You can see what happened in the places that suddenly reduced the number of vaccine that had. The native virus caused polio and caused paralysis. So, I mean, all those things happened, Michelle, right? So it's not that you did not have an effective vaccine. So when there was a pause, when there was a delay, there were more cases of polio caused paralysis and death.
It's funny that you would be so single-mindedly focused on this one outcome of less polio death or less polio cases,
paralysis?
Ignoring everything. I mean, you're a Bolivian.
And I would like to bring us back to that, to that reality of one. And this reality of one is preserved in religion, and religious communities leaned in and came together, and they were able to bear whatever deaths they had, and they went on with their living. And they resisted this mass craze that, the secular scientific community brought upon us. The lockdowns, waiting for the vaccine, happened in the context of the larger vaccination ideology that we've been part of for 150 to 100 years. So the fact that we were isolated, that our elderly were locked in solitary confinement, that we really, made, the lives of our children crazy, that all is part of the vaccination ideology and the existence of this bare live body, that being alive as a physical body is important, that nothing else matters. And Ivan Ilyich writes about this idolatry of life.
No, but we can agree on that. There's nothing to disagree with that. I agree. Of course, I agree on that. And of course, more.
No, you don't agree with that, because you say that thousands of people contracting polio from the vaccine is the price to pay. So you're completely.
No,
you think that
it's a confused and intellectually lazy argument to make. Look, Michelle, the data is that there is data that you cannot get around despite your ideological blinders, right? During the summer of 1955, 3 months after the recall of the Cutter vaccine, there were polio epidemics that spread across the United States. And people were divided because of what had happened with Cutter. Doctors like you, doctors like me, medical nemesis, they said, we don't want the vaccine, right? Some said, no, go ahead and get the vaccine. I think they've made some changes. It is safe. So there was a divided response, right? And what happened? There were outbreaks in Massachusetts and outbreaks in Illinois. During the first week of July in 1955, an outbreak in Boston, right? Polio paralyzed more than 1,700 people. For those who never received Salk's polio vaccine, the incidence of infection was 1 per 500 residents. For those who received just one dose of polio vaccine, the incidence was 1 per 1,000. And for those who received 2 doses, 1 per 2,000. So people who were more vaccinated were 4 times likely, who were not vaccinated, were 4 times likely to get polio than those who were vaccinated. So these decisions we're making are not as simple as you're saying. I mean, once you have a safe vaccine, and unfortunately, to get a safe vaccine, there is a price to pay. And the public should be made aware that there's a price to pay, okay? That there's going to be a price to pay, that we are learning this. We cannot possibly do a trial in 300 million people before going out and doing something. And by the way, we should not hyperbolize risk. So there are lessons to learn here, but it gets washed away in this kind of, in the way that you're talking about it. We should not hyperbolize the risks of the virus. So was it wrong to say that to act like COVID is going to cause a mass death event in young children in the US. Yes, that's completely wrong. We should not do that.
But if you don't hyperbolize, the two go together, because if you don't hyperbolize the danger of the virus, you will never have the uptake of the vaccine. And the vaccine, the logic of the vaccination is that it requires everybody to be vaccinated. So the vaccine is not going to work if only half the population is not vaccinated.
But that's where we should have a conversation. That's where the conversation makes more sense, I think, Michelle. The conversation makes more sense and say we have to acknowledge the fact that if we lead with uncertainty, we will not get 100% uptake, but we will get more trust. And if we get more trust, that's fine. There's going to be a cost to that as well. So there's a cost to everything. But the wrong thing to come about it is to say that we are not going to set up the Rockefeller Institute to figure out how to come up with a
no, of course we need to talk about that, because these people lie. Look at this. It's a paragraph in the book, but I think it's well substantiated. The Salk infection was an injectable, supposedly formaldehyde inactivated version of the polio virus, and they completely disregarded any clues that the inactivation was faulty. There were serious problems with the viral inactivation process that were known by insiders from the outset of the vaccine's development. Any professional objection by scientists involved during the development of the vaccine was rapidly subdued. Dr. Paul Meyer attested to the practice of firing scientists who disagreed with the NFIP, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis plan. So these people, you keep giving them money because you think you buy into their narrative that they've produced such a humanity-saving treatment. But you think that you buy into the narrative. I mean, you are the one who's making the cost-benefit calculation, and I think you're making it completely wrong.
No, but
because you buy into the narrative that this is sort of a God's gift to humankind.
I'm not buying into it. Look, the lockdowns that took place after the polio epidemic swept through the tenements, and they were wrong. It was wrong to take children away. It was wrong to do all those foolish things then. We never learned the lessons, and we did the same thing here.
Okay. China. So don't you think it was wrong to roll out the polio vaccine the way it was rolled out?
No, I don't think. I really don't. I mean, no.
What do you mean it wasn't? The vaccine ended up causing more people than the pandemic.
No, but that's not true, Michelle. I don't know.
That's what Paul Offit said.
That is not true. No.
The disease caused by Cutter's vaccine was worse than the disease caused by natural polio virus.
In that specific.
Right. So that means that the vaccine was rolled out.
Overall, Michelle. Overall, I just read you those numbers about what happened in Boston. Right. Look what happened in Chicago. You have to know these numbers. You cannot gloss over these and just wave your hand at them. In Chicago, right, in 1955. 800 people, right? An outbreak in Chicago paralyzed 800 people. The outbreak lasted 4 months. If you did not get the Salk vaccine, if you chose, because of the Qatar disaster, not to give your child the Salk vaccine, okay? The incidence of infection, 76 per 100,000. That's small, yes? It's like, oh, who cares? 76 per 100,000. If you got one dose, incidence was 30 per 100,000. If you got 2 doses, it was 7 per 100,000. And if you got the recommended 3 doses,
the more boosters, the better.
The incidence was 0. 0 people got paralyzed, Michelle. So if you got the Salk vaccine, 0 children got paralyzed. That is not, if you compare, how can you compare that to the COVID vaccine where everyone gets infected regardless of getting it?
First of all, I wish I had you and Vinay Prasad and Tracy Hook and put these papers or these claims under the ringer, because you're seem to be so quick to accept
but this is different than PCR testing in noses. This is clinical outcome, Michelle. This is
not different.
No,
it's not different. You still have to see exactly how they
you're
counted the cases.
Hey guys, I would like to bring it up. So Anish is arguing from the standpoint of public health and numbers and data, and I would like to backtrack to smallpox vaccination and peasants refusing it. And we think smallpox is this deadly disease. It makes sense to get vaccinated and be saved, but yet these peasants are refusing. Why? And the peasants have this idea that you should have this outpouring of, all of this pus and fluids need to be flowing. And if you suppress it, more and worse, deadlier diseases will come as a result of it. So this folk knowledge of taking a loss here with whatever known plague that we know is better then breeding the plagues that we don't know, but by taking the safety of this vaccine that gives you salvation here and now, but brings the uncertainty of something that we don't know. So there is this tension between health, and Ivan Illich writes about it, and there were many other authors who write about it, what the community can bear and what individuals can bear, and they can put up with it. And then there is this idea of industrialized health, where you want to have a healthy labor force. So you have this idea of, theoretical health that runs very contrary to the folk understanding of health. So you have all of these very complex ideas that are playing together, and your numbers look great, but people don't want it. So your expertise is awesome, but the people deny it. They don't want your knowledge. They're happy in their own little dirty, sick ways.
I don't know.
You're absolutely. These are very important points. Absolutely right,
Yeah.
medical nemesis. Because what Anish is missing is that the main danger is this authoritarian, interventionist, hubristic mentality that has taken over medicine for the last 100 years. And they're willing to do whatever it takes to impose their very narrow view, to advance their careers, to make money, to do whatever they want in the name of advancing medicine. And they can do that because they focus on a very, very, very narrow problem that they supposedly have solved. When you read this chapter on polio, you don't know if they haven't created it to begin with. They may very well have created it to begin with, and then they solve the problem that they've created. But it's a very narrow, aggressive, authoritarian interventionism that says there's that uses the utilitarian argument that there's a price to pay, and therefore any kind of broken eggs on the way to making an omelet, that's life and whatnot. And that's the real danger. That's the real danger that we need to confront and not buy into.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that we should accept every single fact that is in this book, and she has a narrative about vitamin C and whatnot and so forth that maybe weak and not defensible when she makes the authors of the book. But in general, the benefit for me is to demythologize what the current establishment, interventionist, aggressive, hubristic, mendacious group of people are advancing. That's the real danger. The real danger is not to say no. We have to make sure that we get the right thing so that we can advance medicine. Advancing medicine nowadays, meaning a bunch of victims along the way, and that's not right. That's not right under any circumstance.
But we cannot demythologize the fact that you eliminated paralysis in young children because of the polio virus. And yes, there were eggs to be broken in the sense that there was a problem with the.
Wait, hang on. Just on that note, Anish, wasn't polio epidemic in the sense that you have outbreaks? You had outbreaks, right?
We don't have outbreaks anymore.
And didn't polio emerge in the 19th century when it wasn't there before? So the fact that it's gone now, to what extent can you attribute that to the vaccine, and to what extent do you attribute that to other factors that you don't even know about? I mean, I think it's clear that there are many factors.
That's the other place Suzanne Humphries' book fails. She tries to say that it's improving sanitation that is why all these things happen. It's like, okay, I understand malaria went away, but malaria was not going away the way polio was getting worse. So clearly there are things. I mean, it's to not understand that.
It's not understand that. At the very beginning, I said,
like why cholera went away.
The counter narrative in all these polemical books is often weak because they have to propose an alternative explanation, and maybe her alternative explanation is weak, but it doesn't take away from the gist of the book.
But Michelle, if it was the case that the polio vaccine, which is still given now, my child got it, everyone gets it, right? If it was the case that it was causing this much harm, where the heck is polio caused paralysis anymore? It's gone.
You have an error. It's not the harm of the polio vaccine. It's the harm of the mentality that allows. Because in the aftermath of the success of polio, then you have what we've had. You've had, we have COVID. COVID is the consequence of accepting
My friend,
without
so
uncritically.
why can we not differentiate the fact that the polio virus causes something with a significant morbid mortality, and that we don't necessarily have to treat every single virus the way we treat the polio virus, right? Like, I'm not so I'm saying, why do we have to pretend? Like, the reason, I understand that there's a
Right.
myth about vaccines,
Right.
and I understand why it is important to pinprick, explode
Break the
little
bubble, or
balloon. Yeah, whatever. The analogy is is losing me, but I'm losing the analogy. But there's a reason why that bubble, that this aura of this mythological aura when it comes to vaccines. I understand why it may need to be pricked because of how onerous and authoritarian people have been when it comes to COVID. I totally understand it.
Not just COVID, but they were like that in the past. I don't think they were different. I mean, that's the point. The point is, I don't think they were different. I don't think they were like saintly Sabin and saintly Salk and saintly public health people back in the 1950s. I think they were probably equally mendacious and equally ambitious and hubristic and so forth.
They may have been, but unlike the COVID vaccines, they did eliminate polio-caused paralysis, which the COVID vaccines did not do. And we should be honest about it and talk about the fact that, about that. And it's okay. Like, I'm not saying, and we should learn that mandates are always bad. We should learn that, lockdowns and all these authoritarian things that medical, elderly people, like, yes, there are principles, etc. But I think we can't just accept Suzanne Humphrey's narrative that everything would have been better. The notion is that everything, and your notion is that everything would be better if we had not started the polio vaccine campaign. And
no. That's not the point. The point is, the way it was done was bad, and that's enough. That's all you do. That's not the way to do. That's not the way to advance health. The way to advance health is not.
How would you have done it? How would you have done it?
How would I have done it? I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't have been playing with monkeys and passing viruses from one monkey to the next with dirty hands and passing it around to spread.
Michelle, again, how do you have dog models?
I'm not sure. That's not a fair question. That's not a fair question. That's not a fair question.
When we have a problem and we don't know what to do, it doesn't mean that doing something that's bad is necessarily a good idea. Sometimes it's good to not do anything and wait until we figure out a better way to do it, because, we keep vaccinating against all of these microbes. There are more microbes that we can imagine. Once one is gone, the other one will take its place. So a holy place is never empty.
Are you saying,
so it's a losing proposition.
But medical nemesis, we have the data from, we now know from the 1950s and 60s, right? I mean, should we or should we not have initiated a polio vaccine program?
I don't think we should have done it. We should have explored why we have a rise. Why we have a rise in these cases, because there is complex environmental interplay between a host and a microbe. Why does one microbe start rising when the other one is going down? If we approached it as a disease, as complexity, we would have been better off, because we would have been addressing a whole bunch of things, in public health, because we keep trying to fix one disease at a time, but we are losing as a whole, because we're not looking at a whole. We are always fixing parts. It's a reductionist approach that goes back to Rockefeller medicine, to laboratory medicine that was very reductionist. It does not work.
Antibiotics came about in a lab. Should we not study antibiotics and how to kill bacteria?
René Debois, who was one of the first discoverers of antibiotics, immediately in 1944 backed out and said, this is the wrong way to go. You shouldn't be prescribing antibiotics. There will be resistance, because a microbe and a virus and bacteria, they're not static. They evolve, they evolve with us. We will have a problem. And he was proven correct. So why did a man who had the world on a platter in front of him, as somebody who could have had a great career, made a lot of money with making more antibiotics, he backed out of it immediately. He discovered it in 1930s. By 1944, he was out of it, and he was saying this doesn't work. And so his approach did not take hold, his ecological approach. But I think we need to backtrack and start looking at things as a whole.
Well, okay, we can. Okay, I mean, if you have a child or a brother or sister that comes down with meningitis, which is a bacterial infection of the spinal fluid, should we not give them antibiotics?
No, that's the. that's the
meaning. Then I mean, I don't understand. Meaning, how do we backtrack? Do we want to backtrack the theory of giving antibiotics to people who are very sick with a bacterial illness?
When I arrived in the United States, we were given antibiotics for any random sinus infection, ear infection, and whatnot.
This is what I mean. You can't.
This was not a traditional approach in medicine to just keep napalm and everything.
No,
you start giving medicine where you cannot heal on your own.
You're talking about overprescribing, right? I get it that we there's too many antibiotics that may be prescribed for whiffy reasons, and that may breed antibiotic resistance. Okay, that's a bad thing, and we want to avoid that. But we have people that are sitting in hospitals that arrive in the hospital very ill, and they grow out a bacteria that's growing in their blood. What would you have us do with these people?
I would like to actually go and look. Why do we have so many people who are coming down with these very severe infections?
So you want to take a population health perspective to somebody who's dying of a bacterial infection in the hospital?
No, there is a place for clinical medicine, but then there is a different approach for population medicine. And population medicine is intersection between people are capable of doing by themselves instead of waiting to go and buy health. You cannot buy health. The whole idea
I understand, but people do get ill of these bacterial infections or viruses. Are you telling me that we should?
You can apply medicine to somebody who's sick, but then there will be people who will say no, because there comes a time when you treating somebody with antibiotic will not make a difference because it's their time to die.
I understand, but there again, there's a path, and again, I think that path has been proven to be wrong over and over and over again. Like, HIV, what was our response to HIV? We went to war with HIV, and guess what? We won, right? There are many, many, many people that are alive today with HIV that we're managing. Why? Because of a strong regimen of antivirals that we use to keep those things at bay. And if we didn't have those, they would die.
Which comes another question. How did HIV come to
Correct. Because there's a link with polio, isn't there? Medical nemesis?
There is a speculative theory that supposedly was debunked, but I cannot say it's true or not because I am not a lab researcher. I do not understand anything about these viruses. It takes somebody's word for it. Supposedly that theory of connection with polio vaccines was debunked. But, still, where did this HIV virus come from? When did it appear?
Absolutely.
How does it matter?
No, I think it's very important. I agree with you that
it matters.
It matters absolutely. It matters absolutely because you're giving you're giving a free pass to a way of conducting business. You're giving a free pass. You say, since the outcome was the outcome that I think is good and that I would want for my daughter, since the outcome was good, then we have to give a free pass to this way of approaching public health and medicine in general, which means that if there are if there's a price to pay, and if people get aggressive and they lie, well, it's no big deal because at the end of the day they cured polio, and I think that's very dangerous and it's very wrong because
it's human nature.
You discount, you give too much, and that's the reason we had the COVID disaster is because we gave a free pass to the polio, and if we want to learn any lesson, is precisely to realize that it was the same narrative around the time of polio, and they can claim victory for having eradicated polio, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a very shallow, very shallow victory.
But they did eradicate polio, and they didn't eradicate COVID. That's a very different thing.
The polio is not eradicated. We're sitting on a time-fused bomb. CDC is now trying to figure out which vaccine they will deploy, because with social media, each vaccine will have side effects. They're trying to see which vaccine is going to be safer to plan out, because none of the vaccines, and whenever we have the vaccines, they are monovalent, bivalent, trivalent, because they're not perfect. The public thinks that these vaccines work, but none of these vaccines work perfectly. And they keep playing between 4 types of vaccines, essentially, to try to suppress this thing. And
correct. And they're replacing, so they've discredited themselves. They've caused more vaccine hesitancy. They've replaced the wild-type polio virus with a virus that could potentially be more virulent and more causative of paralysis than the wild-type polio virus, because now more and more of the circulating virus is the vaccine-derived virus, and so it's potentially. I'm not saying that it will, but it's potentially I mean, history doesn't end today, and you cannot judge the consequence of the actions of the way the polio epidemic was treated by today as a time frame, or by 1955 as a time frame, or by this. At the end of the day, we don't know how things play out. Did the HIV virus come? I mean, it's conceivable. I mean, there are many things that we don't know, and we will never know. But what we do know is that lying is wrong, is that disregarding, being careless to the point that a lot of people die is wrong. Manipulating the narrative to achieve your own end on a population basis is wrong. So covering up errors is wrong. Letting viruses leak from labs is wrong.
Yeah, vaccine history is always revisionist, and it is always successful in retrospect. But when it happens in real time, like whenever COVID vaccines were rolled out, my Twitter feed was, I kept saying that it's personal protection, it doesn't prevent colonization, it doesn't prevent transmission. But the public and the experts were not in the know. And to say that vaccine or any drug, even a vitamin, that they are safe, a drug by its nature is not a safe product. Somebody will suffer a side effect. Do we give it to people who are healthy? Why don't we concentrate on treating the sick? Why don't we divert our resources to keeping the population? Well, how come our children are underslept? How come, we still can't figure out what to eat to stay well? We think that success is all of the surgery, drugs, and, people who work off the whole electricity, but we are losing. We're not becoming healthier. The whole population going psychotic and becoming paralyzed to the point of not being to live because of a cold is very, very strange. We are not healthy as people because we cannot suffer our reality.
Well said. Unfortunately, I think it's a conflict of visions here. We have the conservative approach, and Dr. Koka, the progressive approach. He's a progressive. He wants the progress. Nothing will stop in the progress of medicine.
Well, I think real progress requires is unfortunately and again, these timescales you talk about. Then by that definition, then we don't know if antibiotics long term may be bad and will kill the human species because there'll be some
we don't know
crazy
that. We don't know that.
Thing.
So if they
then we should also stop. No. We should also stop digging up coal from because we don't know what may happen if we start digging up all this coal and pumping it up into the air. I mean,
that's exactly right. So we have to do it not on the basis of the consequence. You have to do it on the basis of are the means correct? Are you developing antibiotics with the right means by doing it justly, by doing it honestly? By treating people the way they need to be treated.
Either you develop an antibiotic that kills a bacteria or not. Whether you come up with it honestly or, I mean, yes, if you're fraudulent, then you don't come up with an antibiotic that actually kills something, right?
No. You can be fraudulent.
What is this honestly thing? I mean, I don't.
Honestly,
Michelle, at the end of the day, the Salk vaccine, right?
I don't want it.
It works very well. Why don't you want it?
I don't want it. I don't want it.
Because it was developed unjustly?
Yeah, because I don't trust it. I don't trust it.
Why don't you trust it?
I don't trust it. I don't trust it because they
You don't trust it because of Qatar?
Yeah.
No, but since Qatar they figured out why.
So now they've inactivated so much that it probably doesn't do anything. It probably does cause nothing. It probably
do anything. Then why is it that in India there's been no polio since 2011 in a country of 1.1 billion people?
But in Mongolia,
there was no measles.
But it's not caused by polio.
In Mongolia, there was no measles because there was no measles in Mongolia for 5 years. They had eradicated measles because of the vaccine, and then they had the worst outbreak in their history. They had like 50,000. So I don't know why there's no vaccine, no polio. I'm very happy for them. There's no polio, but India has a lot of trouble that have nothing to do with polio, and they have troubles that have to do with aggression and violence and lying and killing and all that stuff. And that I don't want to have anything to do with that. I want that to be eliminated from medicine. I want lying and killing to be eliminated from medicine, and that's not the case. And if we follow in the pathway that has been
of the polio vaccine,
these people are lying and they lie and they don't care. Now, of course, they had a good outcome. We don't even know, but there was a Qatar incident. How can you ignore the Qatar incident?
You're missing the fact that we have a safer vaccine because of all that. If we were still so that is medicine's path, right?
No, it's not. What do you mean? We have a safer vaccine because we kill people? I mean,
No, we have a safer vaccine.
It is historically, but it's not the way it should be. Right? There's a difference between
Michelle,
the way it is historically.
why do we have safe? Why do we have safe surgeries today? Do you think people
Well,
do
they're
not
not always
die?
safe. They're not safe. Absolutely, they're safer
No.
than they were before.
Yes,
right?
I know, obviously, but why are they safer, Michelle? They're safer because we learned from the mistakes of the people who went before.
You could do
It's the
vivisection.
same thing.
You can do vivisection on prisoners and learn a lot from it. Right? If medicine was based, if all the advances of medicine were based on vivisection done on prisoners, you would have the same argument. You say, well, vivisection of prisoners, it's the price to pay. Look, we have organs. You can get organs from prisoners. You can get their organs.
Since we can't do that, we have to practice on non-prisoners.
No,
and
we could.
No, but I'm saying there is no other option. You have to practice somewhere. Who do you practice on?
Does the public know that you as a physician approach them and you are about to experiment on the patient? The patient doesn't know it. They think that you are always doing something. Yeah, they're totally in the dark. The thing is, it's one thing when you agree that it's an experiment, because when I talk to patients, I usually give an example of a vitamin. I say this vitamin is considered generally safe. You might have taken it many times before, but you now is not the same as 3 minutes before. And all the times before when you've taken this vitamin, when you take it now, guess what? It can cause some anaphylactic reaction, and I don't know it. When I give it to you, I give it to you in good faith, but I do not know what will happen now. The patients get scared.
No, that would be silly. I mean, I do some minor procedures, and I tell patients that there are complications from these procedures. The chances that anything really bad happens is incredibly small, but not zero. That's different than saying, here's an mRNA vaccine that was just developed in the last year. The data we have on this many people is this. We don't know exactly what the risk benefit profile is, but and we are learning about it more every day. Do you want to take that? I mean, there's a difference between that. I mean, knowledge is not the same. It's not
but I mean,
the knowledge we have tomorrow. So the knowledge we have now, Michelle, about the Salk vaccine is a lot different than the knowledge we had about the Salk vaccine in 1955. And so to say that the Salk vaccine now, I don't trust it, is frankly silly.
No, but if the same people now developed a new version of the COVID vaccine based on what they've learned so far, and they finally are able to eradicate COVID.
Okay.
Would you then say, "Oh, well, great, that was the price to pay, but now finally, we can say that at the end of the day they won. They won against COVID. They finally developed an mRNA vaccine that eliminates COVID from the planet, and that's the price to pay." That's what I mean. By your logic, that's exactly what would happen.
No,
you would say, great.
No,
COVID was eliminated.
I would say that they should not have tried to cover up some of the adverse events.
But that's exactly.
And they should not. No, but that's what they did, Michelle. I mean, Michelle, the Qatar incident happened. You know how quickly that they discovered this and it turned out, and they then paused development they suspended it for a year, or
they paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine back in 2020. They
didn't suspend, and it hasn't been out since. And they did not suspend the mRNA vaccine for people under the age of 50, blah blah blah, for young males, etc. Those are the mistakes, Michelle. The mistake is not developing the vaccine and deploying it. The mistake is attempting to cover up, and where it happened with polio. That shouldn't have happened, and that's what we should learn from. That the lesson is not don't develop the polio vaccine. That's my point.
Why are we treating healthy people? Why are we approaching a man who is healthy, giving them drugs and making them sick? Is the question that nobody is asking.
No.
We're supposed to be concentrating on treating the sick.
I can tell you exactly why, right? I mean, I can tell you exactly why that's happening, right? Because that's exactly what happened when the vaccine was suspended. And then it came back online in 1955. There are many people that chose not to get the vaccine, right? And those in Chicago who got the 3 doses of the vaccine, right? Zero got paralyzed. Okay. For those who got none of the vaccine, there were 4 times. I mean, there were significantly higher rates of paralysis in that population. But the same thing happened. There's a cost to not doing something. It's not that this whole thing with Illich, it's predicated on the idea that if you don't do something, something bad may not necessarily happen. That's
Listen,
worse than if you do
Herman Cain
something.
did not get the vaccine.
That's not true.
Herman Cain did not get the COVID vaccine and died.
There you go with
Okay,
COVID.
so-
the COVID vaccine is
So no. So some people say, look, he didn't get the COVID vaccine, so it's a terrible thing. Well, I don't know. Maybe the guy in heaven now is saying, I didn't get the COVID vaccine and I have no regrets. So you cannot say just because people survive or there's a narrow outcome that is beneficial, that way that we should give them a pass. The whole point, my take home lesson, and we need to wrap it up here, but my take home lesson is that there's a pattern of exaggeration, of lying, of mendacity, of manipulation of narratives, of manipulation of population.
I'm not trying to do any of those things.
So that's what I'm saying. That's all I'm saying. That's all. That's important. You've been the whole time very defensive about the polio vaccine. If somebody can develop a polio vaccine honestly, without the manipulation, more power to him. That's not what I'm saying. The whole point. I mean, it's missing the point if you don't agree to that.
The whole point of medicine.
And then everywhere you look, and the polio vaccine is their poster child. So if their poster child looks so bad, everything else looks pretty bad. And if it looks pretty bad here, and it looks bad on COVID, and it looks bad on polio, and it looks bad on smallpox, and it looks bad, then you start to wonder, is there something wrong with this whole approach? I mean, that's the whole point.
Michelle, in 1955, if you had recommended, because of the Cutter thing, not to go ahead and get the version of the polio vaccine that Salk was now saying was now we have fixed this, it is now safe. Okay,
right.
There would be patients of yours that would get paralyzed and would die.
Yeah.
On the other hand, a physician that said, I believe it, go ahead, I think the data is good, Salk is saying this now, they fixed it, none of those patients would have died. Okay, none of them would have gotten paralyzed. So look, it is not so easy as to say, okay, I mean, regardless of how you came to point A, you have to make a decision with that patient. And history will say that it was the wrong thing to do to recommend not to get it. I understand why. I would not say to the physician who counseled that person then, knowing what they knew, that they necessarily were immoral or doing the wrong thing, or you should just buy into whatever. But history is what it is. And the history is that, look, it turns out that they should have trusted the process, because they did find out what happened with the Cutter vaccine in terms of the filters and what they were doing. And it turns out that the Salk vaccine, if you got 3 doses, none of those patients in the Chicago outbreak were paralyzed. So that was the proof of the pudding.
No, but now in 2022, isn't it important to go back and say, look, they did it, look at what they did, and look that they how
there were people that got
how unethical they were, and in many ways. So that's all I'm saying.
No, but
we're not litigating.
Well, let me hold on before you say that.
Done.
Let me talk to medical emesis. So medical emesis, that is my answer to you, right? My answer to you is not that you have this thing about why are we treating the healthy. Well, I'm telling you exactly why physicians are put in a position to say, well, I think you should get this prophylactic to keep you healthy, right? And again, patients, it's not doctors forcing it. The patient comes to you and says, what should I do in the summer of 1955 about my child getting this vaccine? And it's the physicians who recommended to go ahead and get the Salk vaccine, they were much safer and they ended up living, whereas did not.
We're confusing here. So you can say that in a population that was given this vaccine, this is what happened. But when you talk to this individual patient, the outcome, you will either get sick or not from the vaccine. So, and you will either get the disease or not. It's very binary, and it doesn't matter how rare it is. It can be 1 in 7 billion, but when this one patient gets the vaccine and gets sick, it's 100%. And if they get maimed, it's 100%. And you have harmed this patient who was well to prevent a population outcome. You didn't do it for this one patient. You're trying to game the outcomes in a population.
No, I don't know why. I don't know why you think that. I mean, I'm recommending that this person take it, not to treat the population, because I don't want this person in front of me to get paralyzed. So,
but you don't know if this healthy person is. The thing is, if this person gets sick, your role as a physician is to treat that patient who got sick from a disease. This has been a historical take on medicine. A sick person subjected themselves to the power of a physician to be treated. Right now, a person who has no problems presents themselves to the physician to be treated for some potential outcome in the population.
But again, I think I'm mostly on your side with most of this because me and Michelle are both actually medical conservatives who don't recommend lots of procedures and don't recommend lots of therapeutics. But that's in large part because a lot of the therapeutics that are out there are marginally effective or not effective at all, and are done for perverse financial incentive. Well, for many of them are maybe done for perverse financial incentives.
Right,
But that would not be the case. That would not be the case for, again, historically speaking, looking at the summer of 1955. This is not the case of the polio virus and why you'd be recommended. So all because we have a ton of different medical therapeutics right now, and you're right, we are awash in healthy people getting procedures for no reason that may harm them. I completely agree with you. That does not mean every single intervention that has come before, or every single intervention that will come in the future, is something that should not be recommended to the healthy patient. If that was the case, then the patient with stable angina at 5 minutes, right? Maybe you don't recommend doing anything to them, right? And again, we can defer on that, but it partly relates to the perceived natural history of the patient with and without therapy. And I think you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater if you basically say, I am not going to do anything to somebody who's healthy in front of me. I'm only going to treat the sick.
Well, and then comes another huge part of a physician acting as God. You think that it is your job to rule over deaths and prevent them. Traditionally, a physician's role was much more limited. You didn't have that responsibility of death prevention, the whole death prevention and viewing death as a failure. It's ideology. There are people who die, whose time it is to die. They are supposed to die, and this is, nothing can be done about it.
But you're taking away. You're speaking for all patients as yourself, but that is not all patients. A lot of patients come into. I'm not. Most of the time, the physician-patient relationship is not, me forcing them to come into my room and me telling them this is what you must do to stay alive. And I know you don't want to stay alive, but I'm going to keep you alive. God damn it! No, the actual relation. The actual thing that happens is that patients come in there very anxious, very worried, because they desperately want to cling to life. There's a 72-year-old who I recently saw who 5 days after having a lung transplant, right, who could not breathe, was just in the most miserable state, on oxygen, high flow, and unbelievably, a 72-year-old with severe refractory idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis gets a lung transplant and is now walking without oxygen, and she can't remember taking breaths like this. So patients like that, nobody's forcing her to get a lung transplant. She could choose to go on hospice and just, die, but she wants to live. and again, it's a longer conversation, but the patients want to live medical medicine. So
there comes this pressure from the public to force physicians to do something that might not be actually in the best interest of the public. The whole, transplant industry.
Right. It's correct. I think I'm with you. It's a different conversation because treating a healthy person is actually not a medical act. Meaning it's not what a doctor needs to do. It's a public health intervention. So that information can come, the person who wants a vaccine can go to a public health dispensary and then make their decision on their own. It's been medicalized, so it's been introduced into, right, the role of the doctor to advise on vaccination, but it needs not be. But anyway, we can't go down that pathway of trying to analyze that. Right. Although I think it's very important as well. But I think we've beaten this horse sufficiently that we can move on. It's been great
thank you so
to
much
have you, medical nemesis. Your points were very well taken and very well articulated. And
for having me. Absolutely. I think all three of us agree that vitamin C does not cure polio or doesn't cure anything other than vitamin C deficiency. I think we're in agreement on that one.
I think that's correct. Certainly. It's interesting because there are some principles of medicine that one should be able to articulate and sort of, but they're difficult to articulate. But here it would be that if you start with a healthy patient who's eating what people should normally eat, which is a well-balanced diet, then they should get everything that they need. And then normal healthy people should not be walking around taking large amounts of vitamin C in order to remain healthy. I mean, that seems to be off, and that's a problem that I have with the book here. It seems it's sort of a paradox that we say, healthy humans beings don't need vaccines, but they need 13 grams of vitamin C. Anyways,
all right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
It's
so
been
much.
such a pleasure. Yes, thank you.
Alrighty, take care. Bye-bye.